Divinity School, Texas Christian University. I could recite many of the credentials of Dr. Gaston Foote. He has all of the credentials. Just let me say to you that he is a beloved pastor wherever he has been. He is a writer and a professor, and we await hearing him with a great deal of eagerness this morning. I think I must remind you of one thing that I've heard over and over since I have been here as pastor studying something of the history of this church. There's a little saying regarding the history of this church that says that Rice built it, Foote filled it, and McGowan paid for it. After meeting Dr. Gaston Foote yesterday afternoon for the first time and having an opportunity to talk with him, I understand now why he filled this church. After the reading of Holy Scripture this morning, Dr. Gaston Foote from Fort Worth, Texas, a former minister of this church, will preach to us. The scripture lesson for today is from 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, 16th through the 18th verses. So we do not lose heart, though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Thus endeth the reading of the scripture lesson for this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Butts. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As a matter of fact, at my age, I'm glad to be anywhere. I came here in 1938. I came in 1941. 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, before the war started. And I left 2 weeks after peace was declared in 1945. I don't know whether there's any connection between the war and my presence here or not, but it was a great joy for me to serve these people. And I have remembered you all through these years. And I'm interested when I was thinking about my experience here in the war years. I hope there was no particular connection. And then I began to wonder whether or not there's any connection between my being here now the second time and April Fool's Sunday. I hope there's not any particular connection in that respect either. I remember when we left here, there was a very lovely Southern lady who expressed something of the sentiment that she felt the group had. I think it's a Woman's Missionary Society or something of that sort. And she led the prayer at the conclusion of the service when she was blessing Lucy Lee and me when my wife and I were packing up, going to Ohio. And this is really what she said in her prayer. O Lord, bless brother and sister Foote as they go to preach in the Yamdanky country of the Northland. And I remember that all through the years that I'd been away. I think after we had announced that we were away, going away rather, I said, the Lord has called us to go to preach elsewhere. And immediately after that, this woman in the Missionary Society got up and announced the hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. I remember I was leaving my church in Fort Worth some years ago now, going on Monday morning and not coming back until Friday afternoon. And the secretary caught me by the coattail and she said, "You have to give me your sermon title next Sunday morning. What are you going to preach about?" We have to have the bulletin on Thursday. And I said, "I really have no idea what I'm going to preach about next Sunday morning. You'll just have to put in the bulletin, the pastor preaches." Well, she said, "What are you going to preach about on Sunday night?" I said, "I do have some remote idea about that. I'm going to preach about that passage in the Psalms where it said, 'The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God.'" Now, I told her to use her ingenuity and give me a title for the Sunday evening service. Well, she had a lot more ingenuity than I thought, because when I got back, I saw the bulletin beautifully printed when I came in Friday afternoon. At 10:45 a.m., the pastor preaches. 7:30 p.m., what the fool said. Ministers have a lot of experiences that they sometimes dare to share with other people. I suppose no matter how long I live, I'd love to preach. I wonder about old Methuselah, who lived 969 years. I rather have the feeling that they were lunar years, because if you divide 13 lunar years, you see, in a year we have, if you divide 13 into 969, you'd get a respectable 73, and I think that's about as long as Methuselah actually lived. But at any rate, I've thought about that old boy. I wonder what he did with all of his life. 969 years, can you imagine what he did with it? I suppose he did a lot of sitting around the courthouse square, chewing tobacco and cussing the government, like people have been doing for a long, long period of time, I suppose. And I thought about if he had been to as many church meetings as I have been to, and had been served as many meals as I've been served in churches, if he'd eaten as much meatloaf as I've seen in front of me through all of those years, well, if he'd had all that meatloaf, and when I'm reminded of the fellow who said if all the meatloaf that he'd ever eaten were laid in to end, he'd let it lie there, and I can understand that too. We had a very unusual schedule one particular Sunday at church. Not only were the first two services we had at this church, but we likewise had two weddings in the afternoon. One of them is at 4 o'clock in the chapel in the church, and across the east part of the city of Fort Worth, there was a 5 o'clock wedding in the garden. And I didn't have time to change my black robe and my white surplice. So my wife and I got in the car, and we were rushing from one wedding service to another wedding service. And we missed a stoplight, on the side of the road, a stoplight. Just sort of eased by it, And one of these gentlemen dressed up, in a uniform, pulled me over to the side and said, "Father?" Well, I knew I was in a mess when he called me father. He said, "You ran that stoplight." I said, "Well, I'm very sorry. I don't really try to break the law. I'm sorry about that. And I promised a lot of things, And he said, "Well, that's all right, but be careful next time." And my wife, more conscientious than I am, said, "Now, honey, you made a mistake there. That man thought you a priest." Well, I said, "It doesn't bother me so much as who he thinks I am. I really wonder about who he thought you were." One of the most fascinating words, I think, in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians are these words: "The things that are seen are temporary, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Or as was read to you a moment ago, the things that are seen are transient. They pass away. But the things that are unseen are the only things that are eternal. In these Lenten weeks, let us ask ourselves, what's really important? What is the ultimate of importance, values? What is that which lasts beyond the stars? That's what Paul is saying. beyond the universe as we know it, with its billions of years of history, beyond the gigantic explosion that started all of the universe, what is there beyond that which we can see? What is that which is ultimate in terms of value? That's what I want to talk about. Studdard Kennedy was a brilliant preacher from England who came over in the 20s. Some of you are not aware of what I was talking about, but I was a freshman in college. I'd been a freshman for 3 years, as a matter of fact. And Studdard Kennedy came to the chapel service, and I remember one thing that he said, only one thing that he said. Many of the times I slept in chapel, but in this instance I really was aware of what the man was talking about. He was a brilliant preacher, and he said, when you stand before the judgment bar of God, there'll only be one question they'll ask you. Well, that got my attention. They won't ask you whether you were Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian or disciple of Christ or a Catholic or Jewish or Muslim. They won't ask you whether you were black or white. That makes a lot of difference to a lot of people. They won't ask you when you lived or where you lived or why you lived. They'll ask you one question, he said, when you stand before the judgment bar of God, and it's simply this. You were given 70 years and 10, or 80 years, or 50 years. What did you do with it? That's all they'll ask you. What did you do with your life? Elton Trueblood speaks to this particular issue when he tells a story about a young man immediately after the Second War. He was about 30 years of age, and he enrolled as a lowly freshman in Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, not too far from Dayton, Ohio, where we were. And he told me this story in his office when I was there to speak in the chapel. He said this young man at 30 years of age came after he'd been 10 years as a successful businessman, and he came to enroll as a lowly freshman in this little college to get his Bachelor of Arts degree. And Dr. Trueblood asked him why. He says, well, Dr. Trueblood, you do not know what I've been doing. But in the last 10 years, I've been working in a brewery down at Newport, Kentucky, and I just didn't want it to be said that all I did with my life was to make a little beer. He was asking himself the question, what did you do with your life? With that thought in mind, I'm reminded of on the facade of the most magnificent cathedral, I suppose, in all of Western Europe, is the cathedral at Milan, Italy. There are 3 main entrances to the cathedral, as in many cases there are. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in one instance. On the left facade, going into the left door, you will find written in Latin, but translated in English, these words. All that pleases is but for the moment. On the right facade, or the right door, going into the right transept, you will find written in Latin, but translated in English, these words. All that troubles is but for the moment. Over the central transept, where Pope John Paul has Mass when he comes to Milan, where the high altar is, you'll find written in Latin, but translated in English, these words, that only is important, which is eternal. Now I want to talk just a few minutes about each one of those particular things. All that pleases is but for the moment. We spend a great portion of our time inevitably in these days of inflation trying to make a living. And Jesus, of course, admonished us to labor. The Bible talks about 6 days shalt thou labor, and that's as important as the 7th day of rest. This is a command. Life is worthless without labor. Jesus said, lay up for yourselves treasures. But he said, be careful where you lay them up, not where moth and rust doth corrupt, or where thieves break through and steal. Lay up for yourselves treasures. Work. 6 days shalt thou labor. The interesting thing is that all of the money that we produce in a lifetime never ultimately lasts. There's nothing more temporary around our house nowadays than a $20 bill. I remember of having gone in Asheville, North Carolina, to this lovely Biltmore estate. built by old Cornelius Vanderbilt, who used to traffic in railroads. He'd buy a railroad all out. He has steamship companies. He was a multimillionaire. I think it's his grandson who built the Biltmore Estates around Asheville, North Carolina. George Washington Vanderbilt was his name. But Cornelius Vanderbilt, when he was about 88 years of age, was walking in the gardens. He loved flowers. I've always thought there was something beautiful about a person who loved flowers or loved trees. Poems are made by a fool like me, but only God can make a tree. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was out there at 88 years of age. He couldn't sleep at night. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, he's looking around in the garden, and his nurse came to him. Said, "What's the matter, Mr. Vanderbilt? Are you ill?" He said, "No, I'm not ill. I'm sorry if I disturbed you, but I was looking at these hands of mine. Hands that have written checks for $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, $100 million. And now they're empty. Empty. What's a few $1 million to an old man with a stomach ache? All that pleases is but for the moment. It never lasts. Take not only the matter of making money, but the matter of fame. There are so many people that have an idea that the sine qua non of all values is in terms of the things that you accumulate and the fame with which you live. And yet we know that fame is a passing thing. It never lasts. You can be a hero one day and a zero the next. Ask any quarterback on a football team. He'll call one particular play on one Saturday afternoon. They'll win the game by that play. The next Saturday afternoon, they'll lose the game by the same figure, by the same signal. Fame never lasts. I was Merv Griffin. I stay in the Holiday Inns quite often when I'm away from my city. That's one reason I appreciate the governor's house here. But at any rate, I was watching the afternoon show at the Holiday Inn, and Merv Griffith came on with his talk show. And he had all of the heroes of the contemporary day. I think he had Pete Rose, baseball fame. He had Earl Campbell of football fame. He's a Texan. You may not, and the word may not have gotten over here that Earl Campbell is one of the great football players. He had Billie Jean King, and he had Mark Spitz, the great swimmer. All of them well known. And yet we know that day after tomorrow, or a week from now, or a month from now, or a year from now, the fame that they will have enjoyed today will not be theirs. Someone else will come along. All that pleases is but for the moment. It never lasts. Now move, if we would please, in that second framework. All that troubles is but for the moment. Now, we may be absolutely sure that trouble is for real, but it's never forever. It never lasts. I've had the profound conviction that the more faith we have in the eternal goodness of things, the less fear we have. And the more fear we have, perhaps the less faith we have. There's an old 4-line quatrain that runs something like this: never trouble trouble until trouble troubles you, for you're sure to make your trouble double trouble if you do. Jesus said, be not anxious about food, drink, clothing. I may be going against the grain now because there may be people who are anxious about food and drink and clothing. But Jesus said, look how the flowers grow. God does it. You don't have to get out there and talk to the flower and make it grow. I've prayed for flowers and they've died. So I know that you can't do anything unusual in that particular. The amazing thing is, you see, that we are consciously sitting on the anxious seat. Worry, fear, anxiety. I remember the story is told of King David when he became the king of Israel. He wanted all of his soothsayers to give him a particular type of phrase that he would use in every emergency that might come up in his reign as king. And after many months of study, the soothsayers came back to the king and said this: it too shall pass away. It too shall pass away. I remember the story of the black preacher. He was a great philosopher. There are some wonderful preachers of that complexion. And this black preacher was asked to give his particular and most valuable text in the Bible. And he said, the text that I love most is that text where it says, it came to pass. And some biblical scholars said, that's not a real text. That's simply the introduction to a story. It came to pass that a man had 2 sons, etc., etc. Oh, he said, that's a great text. It came to pass. It didn't come to stay. And that's fascinating to me. There's a story of 2 GIs during the Second World War. They had both pledged their troth to their girlfriends and received the troth of their girlfriends, that when they came back from the war, in this area we had Maxwell Field and Gunner Field and soldiers all about us. And it reminded me of the story of this fellow that told his girlfriend that he would marry her when he came back as a colonel or a lieutenant colonel or a buck private or what have you. And one of them, the girlfriend married the flatfoot across the street, and lived scrappily ever afterwards. That broke the old boy's heart. And so he went out to the river and decided he would end it all, and he just drowned himself. Well, there was another fellow had the same experience. His girlfriend deserted him and married somebody else. And he wrote a song about it. Do you remember that song? I was waltzing with my darling to the Tennessee Waltz when an old friend I happened to see. Well, that was where he made a mistake. He introduced his girl to that old friend, and the old friend married the girl. But he made $250,000, I understand, out of that song. Now, $250,000 might not cure a broken heart, but it'd certainly help. All that pleases is but for the moment. I remember when I was in SMU, so do they, as a matter of fact. And I was about to graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree, but I didn't have an athletic sweater. I wanted one of those coveted Mustangs, big, beautiful red letter M. I just didn't feel like that I could go out in West Texas, where those cowboys and so forth lived, and get along in the ministry unless I had an athletic sweater to prove that I was a man. So I decided I would go out for track, and the only thing that I could do, I couldn't play basketball or football or baseball, so I decided I'd go out for long distance run, and I was pitted against an old boy from A&M. I've never liked him since. I got just about to the 2-mile stretch, and was doing my very best. This old boy from A&M came tearing in front of me, and hit the tape. I think he was praying while he was running, Lord, I'll pick him up if you'll lay him down. And he certainly was laying him down. The interesting thing is, obviously, that we are concerned about those things that destroy our happiness. And I wanted to pit my energies and felt that I could not get along without that coveted Mustang letter. I found out nobody cared. If I had gotten that letter, it had been moth-eaten. It had been 55 years ago. Pretty difficult to have a letter that lasts 55 years. We wonder about, and I went to my father's house after I'd lost the race. My father was a circuit riding preacher in Northwest Texas Conference. Paducah Circuit. It'd be bad enough to be at First Church Paducah, but to be on the Paducah Circuit was really something. So we were out there, and my father, after I'd showed up in the middle of the semester, having gone away from school, my father said, "What are you doing here? You ought to be in school." And I said, "Well, Dad, I just didn't want it to be said. I just didn't want it to be said that I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree and didn't get an athletic sweater." So he carried me out and saw an old jackrabbit running down the road. The ground was prepared for cotton planting. And this old jackrabbit would run down some of those meadows, and he'd stick his ears up, stop and look at us, and then he'd go along a little bit ways and stick his ears up and look at us. Dad said, "Do you see that jackrabbit?" I said, "Of course I see him. He's as big as a mule, I said, "What's that got to do with my leaving college?" Well, he said, "That jackrabbit can run 5 miles in 5 minutes. And he's never even been to college." And I thought about, well, what's really important about this business? It's not whether I can run that fast or not. It's what I'm seeking to do with my life. We worry about the things that already have happened. This is the most amazing thing, isn't it? I've known people that worried about whether or not they married the right woman, and they've already celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Should I have married Jean or Jane? Mary or Susie? You know, it's an interesting thing. We worry about the things that have already happened. Silly. We worry about the things that inevitably happen. Death, for instance. I read a book some time ago about a fellow who had gotten fat and 40 and rich all at the same time. It's not easy. But he got fat and 40 and rich at the same time. And then he began to worry about his health. He carried pills in every pocket, and as a result of his anxiety about his health, fat and 40 and rich, as a result of his worry, he died. Which is the end of the story. We worry about the things that are inevitable. We worry about the things that never do happen. And that is a great tragedy, isn't it? I remember the story of the young lady who was a spinster. She had been working for 40 years in the business world. And every night she had as her custom, looking down under the bed to see if there was some lurking burglar who, during the darkness of the night, might crawl out from under the bed and slit her throat. But every evening, after all of those 40 years of hard labor, she would still look under the bed to see if the burglar was there. And I imagine if she had seen one, she would have died, not from fright, but from surprise that the burglar finally made it to that particular place. We worry about the things that never do happen. All the troubles is but for the moment. Many people dig their graves by anxiety. Be not anxious about tomorrow. This is a biblical injunction. Now move, if you will, please, to that central figure, that central area. That only is important, which is eternal. Christian stewardship, as I see it, is taking the things you cannot keep and investing them in the things you cannot lose. You can't keep time. You just invest it. You can't stop a watch and let time go on all the time. Time is continually fleeting. You cannot keep money. You can simply invest it. Christian stewardship is taking the things you cannot keep and investing them in the things you cannot use. Take, for instance, the matter of time. We have an opportunity to go across the street and be an individual who will minister to the needs of a broken-hearted man or a woman or a boy or girl who is reaching out for you. And you and I have responsibilities in the dedication of our time. When I later became a student in theology, I had a difficult time in making my own way, as many people do. And so I decided I would go down to the dean of the School of Theology, where I went to school, and talk to him about staying in school, because I had a very difficult time of getting all my money together, paying my tuition and my board. I went about 6 o'clock in the evening. I should have known at that time that you are not supposed to visit professors at 6 o'clock in the evening when they're seated to dinner with their family. Since I've been a minister, I figured that 6 o'clock in the evening is a very good time to visit people when they're eating, hopefully. And he invited me into his home. He was a PhD from Vanderbilt University. And he treated me just like a human being. I sat there with his daughter and his son and his wife at the table, and he treated me just like a person. And before I had left that place, he put his arm around me and he said, "Gaston, you won't have to leave. I'll see to that." I never asked him for a dime in my life, but I knew if he believed, I would believe too. He invested 20 minutes of his time and changed the course of my life. Dr. Carpenter was known and loved by everyone in the community. And then the time came when Dr. Carpenter became rather old. Some people who had known him so many years and had loved him because he had been in their home in the time of every crisis, they came to get the plows sharpened in the blacksmith shop at this old, not a department store, but that's really what it was. They sold everything from collar buttons to cultivators. And he had his office, the doctor had his office in the attic of this building, and the stairway was on the outside. And underneath the canopy of the building was a flapdoodle red sign, Dr. Carpenter, with a hand-painted sign pointing upstairs. So the people who knew him and loved him and owed so much to him, they went up to knock on the door. They opened the door, and they found Dr. Carpenter seated at his roll-top desk with an old Oliver typewriter in front. And he had his hands on the desk and his forehead on his hands, for he'd made his last call. They never had a funeral like that. Never. All of the people's best friends had passed away. And you can imagine the flowers, like a dozen trucks had just collided, and flowers, acres of ground on the acres of... But the undertaker forgot one thing. He didn't have anything to go to the head of the grave. A little old barefoot, freckle-faced boy saw the difficulty, anticipated. He ran from that little country cemetery up to that store and stood on an old pork barrel and took this sign that had been flopping in the wind through all of those years and put it out at the head of the grave. Dr. Carpenter, upstairs. That's about it, isn't it? The only thing that's really important is what you take with you upstairs. Isn't that what Jesus said when he ascended on Easter?